Welcome back to another edition of the Edge podcast. Publisher Brenden Slaughter here for BeaversEdge.com, joined by Beavers Edge podcast co-host and KEGO radio host TJ Mathewson, joining us here on the Edge podcast. We're back. Oregon State fell to Utah over the weekend. We're at Beavers Edge. We're ready to flush that, move on to this next game against Stanford coming up. TJ, welcome back to the pod, man. How are you doing? And how excited are you for Oregon State to get back to the field this weekend?
I'm doing good, Brendan. How do we think my background looks? I got a change of scenery here for our podcast today, but I think it looks good. It's nice and soundproof in here. I think it's more soundproof from where I normally record in the KEJO studio right over there. But there's another podcast being recorded, the OSU Beavers whatever official podcast being recorded in that room with Terry Boss right now. So. I'm sitting here in this room next door all by myself, so it's good. And yeah, man, quite the game on Saturday. It's interesting to hear some different perspectives. I think I've mentioned it a couple times, but I host the post-game call-in show after the broadcast on Saturday. So I'm usually one of the first to sort of hear the frustrations. You, of course, we can look at the damn board as well and keep an eye on that as well. But, I get to hear it firsthand from some people on the phones. And there were a lot of very frustrated people. And there was a lot of people, honestly, I thought were pretty level-headed. I mean, if you looked at the schedule at the beginning of this year, and on our show earlier this year, before the season started, we played the pocket schedule game where you go in and you pick every game. This game was a loss, almost like a consensus loss, right? But here we are after the game, and people are mad they lost the game.
Yeah.
Now, you watch the game, right? And there was so many things the Beavers could have done way better. And, they outgained Utah in total yards, passed for more yards, ran for more yards, had 5 trips in the red zone, but with no touchdowns, and threw 4 interceptions. I mean, sometimes it's as simple as that, man. You like the last 2 weeks, when you have these big moments, the best teams execute and finish in those moments, and the Beavers not even like really one time did that in the last 2 weeks, and that's why they lost twice. It's right. It's pretty simple, right? I mean, who was it yesterday? I think it was Joshua Gray who was like, yeah, we ran like 154 total plays against Utah, but you can both sides, that is offense and defense and special teams. You can go through and you can pick out something wrong in every game, in every play, right? But still, even you played for the most part pretty well, like on the outside looking in, you played, pretty fine, even if the score doesn't reflect that. So it's just sort of been a lot to digest here in this week, Brendan, and it's trying to, walk people off the ledge, especially me, sort of an outsider-ish coming in. I didn't grow up with Beaver football like you did, or like a lot of the people who listen to this podcast do, or write in on the damn board, right? I'm new here. I'm the new kid on the block. So it's sort of, it's interesting to peer in at that perspective, but I just don't think it's the end of the world. I don't. And I think this weekend, the opponent in Stanford, I think it is as good of an opportunity to get right as you could ask, unless you're going to play ASU or Colorado. I mean, all the things the Beavers have been struggling with, Stanford does terribly, like just awful.
Yeah.
But we'll get into that as we go along.
For sure. No, and I think you hit on a lot of great points there. And, I think to kind of, pick out some of the pieces there, I mean, as you mentioned, I think we have a big time crossover audience, people that are on the damn board or talking to you on your show post game and vice versa. And I think, all Beaver Nation is a pretty cohesive group, and, just kind of getting those perspectives and opinions, because it was a frustrating loss. And I think that's where, unlike the USC game where that hurt for a different kind of a reason than the Utah game hurt. And I think while you're right, TJ, a lot of people on the pocket schedule did maybe peg this Utah game as a loss. The USC game was a little bit more open-ended. And I think as we look at that on the scorecard now and realize how close that game was, it's where, the 4 turnovers in that game and then the 4 turnovers in this Utah game, really rear their ugly head. And the thing that I've seen, thrown out this week that I have a tendency to agree with, TJ, is that Oregon State's gotten great production from 21 of 22 positions in Pac-12 play. And I've seen it written about by journalists, seen it written about, talked about on our damn board. We've talked about it on our radio show on Rip City Mornings this week as well. Just the fact that is it too much to say that if Oregon State had consistent quarterback play, they'd be 2-0 in Pac-12 play right now? I think it is deeper than that, but on the surface, that's what it looks like. And that's where those frustrations can come from. And I've seen it over and over again. And we've seen, quarterback debates on our board, and we'll obviously get into the status of Chance Nolan and whether or not we'll see him or Ben Goldbrinson on Saturday. But I think just when you look at that and you kind of peel it back and you see that first big thing is you see a defense that's playing better. You see special teams that didn't make, massive mistakes. And then you see an offensive running game that was able to run the ball against, USC and Utah, more so against the Utes. But then you see Oregon State just couldn't throw the ball worth a lick,
Yeah. And I'd say the biggest sort of point that kind of hit home with me after that game of how Oregon State fans are looking at this, media in general, makes sense. Our first caller I had on the post-game show, Andy, always calls in. He's fantastic, gives great analysis. He said there's no reason to think that the Beavers wouldn't be the best team in the Pac-12 with competent quarterback play. There's no reason. They've given you no reason to think anything else than if they got competent quarterback play after these first two Pac-12 games, they would be the best team in the conference.
Right.
And I didn't think about it that way. And I'm like, thinking about now, I think about it, I'm like, yeah, right. That absolutely makes sense. When you look at the rosters, when you look at the box score, you look at the yards per play, look at the opportunities that were there. I mean, it's all there. It really is. You just went toe to toe with the two best and two most talented teams in the conference, and you went toe to toe and ended up, again, just not executing and such. And in that sense, I do understand it. But that, again, just shows you how important the quarterback position is. It really is. A bad quarterback can drag down a great roster. A great quarterback can drag up a bad roster. I mean, it's really is as simple as that.
Right. And I think, that I think to answer your point when you're like, you saw a lot of frustrations and this and this and that. And I think also going along with that point, TJ, is, it's been a long 10 years for Oregon State. You think about the last time they got to a marquee bowl game was 2012 when they lost the Alamo Bowl. Obviously got to the Hawaii Bowl in 16 and in 13, and got to the LA Bowl this last year. But not necessarily like, dynamic seasons that you're riding home, talking about at the sports bar with your buddies kind of a thing. It's like, Oregon State had a good season. They went to a bowl game. But when you're talking about getting back to that, 8-9 wins that we saw in the mid 2000s or even in 2012, and I think a lot of Oregon State fans were maybe, because it's easy being like, oh, hey, is this, as good of a team as 10 years ago and 3-0 start. And that 2012 team, raced out to a 6-0 start before they lost their first game. So I think there's kind of like that Beaver fans wanting to have it all at once. And I totally understand that, being, someone who, like you said, has been around the team for, my entirety of my life, is because it's been a long slog to kind of get through the, Anderson era, get through the rebuilding part of the Smith era, and then, get just a little taste of success last year, even though they didn't win the bowl game, and then it raced out to the start that they did. I think all those things kind of combined, and then you saw, obviously the highlighted poor quarterback play. So I think it's a lot of individual factors, but I think it's very easy to kind of look at the big, 4 or 8 turnovers in 2 games. And it's very simple. I wrote about it after USC, and I, alluded to it and wrote about it a little bit after Utah, TJ. If you turn the ball over 4 times in a game in the Pac-12 and you don't force any, you don't deserve to win, period. Nope. And that's, again, that frustrating factor is, while everyone wants to, pile on Chance Nolan, and there's some necessary blame there, you look at the defense, they haven't forced a turnover in 2 weeks. While they played better and, showed us some really good things, they're not turning around and putting the ball back into the hands of the offense. So I think it's, when you combine all those factors, it's just combined, plus throw in, the fact that, like you said, those are 2 of the best teams in the conference outside of maybe Oregon. And I think, you have your answer. So the big thing now is, you can't play Monday morning quarterback, as it goes now. You have to improve and move on. And I think that's where, based on the interviews that you've had this week with the offense and defense, it seems like, the Beavers are moving on well. And particularly as we're recording this podcast on a Wednesday, you talked to Trent Bray today, and he even said he likes the team's response this week following the adversity compared to the team's response last week after that USC game. And we all kind of knew that. We knew that was going to be an emotional, how do you turn the page? And it's hard to know. I mean, we haven't talked to Chance Nolan. Did the USC game linger in his head a little bit? Was he thinking about it? All those kind of things. I think to put a bow tie on this point, TJ, it's a very long point. I think when you put all those things together, that's why Oregon State's staring at an 0-2 start. Certainly highlighted by the turnovers, but there's lots of little things. There's, execution, play calling, this, that. And I think when you line up all those things together, maybe the hangover a little bit, it sets the stage for where we are now. And, we'll obviously talk about what we can do, but would you kind of agree? Is that kind of what you've seen the first 2 weeks too?
Yeah. And I just thought it was interesting they said that, because last week when we talked to them, the sentence that stayed with me was, we can't let USC beat us twice.
Right.
Those exact words, I forget who said that. And I guess when Trent Bray said that today, you think, well, did they then? They might have. When apparently it was an emphasis to not let that happen. Right. It still ended up doing it. So that's interesting, something to think about. And I guess to turn to a more optimistic page, Brenden,
definitely.
You look at the rest of the schedule. Are there 9 wins still left on that schedule? 7 games to go. Are there 9 wins left on that schedule? And I say yes. I absolutely think so. So we can think about it this way. You have one tough road game left. You play at Washington after the bye week on a Friday night. You will not be favored in that game. You will, I don't know, anywhere from a 3-point to a touchdown underdog, I would guess.
Unless Washington just collapses between now and then. I suppose that could happen.
You could be a favorite, right?
Right.
So you have Washington.
Who knows if they'll be ranked too in that game? Who knows if Washington will still be ranked in that matchup too?
Correct. You have Washington State at home, good team, you will be favored. And your team for the last 2 years is much better at home. It's not even close. And then your final home, the rivalry game, the final home game. Will they be favored? Maybe not. But, you're going to take a rivalry game at Reser, right?
Right.
And who knows what can happen, right? So you think about that. It's like, okay, so you might lose one of Washington or Oregon.
Right.
That puts you at 9 wins because you'll be favored against every other team. And, exercising demons with Washington State. I mean, I think they play this game at Reser Stadium. I think Oregon State beats Washington State.
Yeah.
But we'll have to see them play it out on the field. But the rest of the games, let's talk about Colorado. They're playing Stanford this week. They get to go down to Tempe and play the Sun Devils. I mean, those are all wins. That puts you in a bowl game right there with those 3 bad Pac-12 teams, right?
Yeah.
That puts you at the game. And, you could very easily be 6-2 going into the bye week. And then, the what if game could be played. But if you just sort of just think about it that way, I mean, you're pretty much going to be a Vegas favorite to go 6-2 into your bye week. And you take that.
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely something to the schedule easing up. And I think that's crucial for Oregon State. And that's kind of the, you remember that old lesson, TJ, when we were kids and you were sitting around the dinner table and, mom and dad explained you had to eat your vegetables first. That's pretty much the situation here with Oregon State is, we, from the beginning of the year, we're like, oh, goodness, Oregon State has to open with Boise State and Fresno State before they get Montana State, right? As it turns out, Boise and Fresno, maybe not as good as we thought, but neither here nor there. Then you look at Pac-12.
UConn.
Right? Then you look at Pac-12 play. You open with the 2 toughest teams outside of Oregon, and we'll get to them in a minute. But outside of those 2 teams, that's it. So it's like, regardless of whether or not this team was better or not, that was, a gauntlet as far as, having 2 teams that are just really good, 2 teams that I think have a chance to win what would have been the Pac-12 South this year, as it's no longer existent. But I think that's worth mentioning, and in itself, right?
Yeah.
And then
I go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh yeah, and then the schedule itself from there, like you said, you get Stanford. It pains me to say this, but David Shaw, I'm surprised that his Cardinal program has gotten to this point. He's one of my favorite coaches in the Pac-12, and an awesome dude to talk about. And I think he's won some big time games and continue that success of the program. But you look at Stanford, they have not had a winning record in 3-4 years now. They've lost 10 straight games to FBS opponents. So that's a get right game for Oregon State. You mentioned some other teams. As far as some games on the schedule, like Washington State, I think will be a tough game, but I agree with you. I think Oregon State will be favored. I think Cal will be a tougher game than Oregon than maybe expected, and I think Oregon State will be favored. Colorado, that's Oregon State's gimme game this year. No disrespect to the Buffs. Maybe they get some life under their interim coach, who I don't know who it is. Help me out, TJ. Do you know who their interim is?
I do not know. No.
Yeah, I should know this. Bad.
Although it sounds like we might have an idea who they might look at in the offseason.
Right. And then, like you said, it's hard to know what Arizona State's going to be like on their senior day with whatever semblance of their program this year.
There's been a lot of movement, so I don't know how many 4-year seniors are left there.
Right. But like you said, for all those reasons, I agree with you. I think the Washington game will be very tough, and I think the Oregon game will be very tough. Outside of that, there are games that you're probably going to have a shot at being expected to win. And, like you said, even if you played that game, TJ, and you finished with you won, all but 2 more games, and you went 8-4. Would that still not be a season that Oregon State fans would be really happy about?
Mm-hmm. And like, it wasn't too long ago where 8 wins seemed like, going to the moon, right?
It did.
To the moon. To the moon. Exactly. We don't have to keep rehashing the Gary Anderson era, but
no.
8-4, go to a bowl game, finish 9-4. I mean, that sounds pretty good to me, right?
Yeah, and
I know people might want more, and I don't think it's unfair to expect more out of your football program, but sometimes that's just how stuff shakes out, right? It's sports. We don't always get what we want, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, I think, like I said, out of the 7 games that they have left, I think there's a possibility to, I think there's a chance to win them all. I think there's a chance to win a middle number. I think there's a chance to, win, maybe a lower number if things don't break right. And I think that's going to lead us into our next point, and something that I think is going to determine it all, TJ. Quarterback play. Quarterback play is going to determine how many games this team wins. I think the defense has got to a point where it's going to keep the team in games this year. I don't think there's going to be any problems on special teams, and I don't think there's going to be any problems running the ball. I think that Oregon State would benefit from naming Jam Griffin the starter, but I'm not offensive coordinator. The committee lives on. So
the committee does live on, yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how that all shakes out. But I think it comes down to quarterback play. Officially, as of this recording this podcast on Wednesday, Chance Nolan, per Jonathan Smith's words, going
to be like all of us.
Yeah, day-to-day, going to be watched. So whatever you want to call that, I'll call that questionable going into the week. It's practices are closed. It's unclear whether he's been able to practice or not. If he's not, Jonathan Smith has said it will be Ben Gulbranson taking the snaps under center or from the shotgun. However, Oregon State lines up to start the game. Let's just dive into that, TJ. What does that mean? What does that mean on the first? Let's just kind of get into it of what that could potentially mean in these next 7 games. As if Nolan can go, if he looks good, if Nolan can't go, if Gulbranson comes in, looks good, what happens then?
So I'm curious to see how much the game plan would change. The coaching staff, or at least listening to them this week, the offensive guys yesterday as we record this on a Wednesday, they said the game plan really doesn't change that much with Ben to Chance. But it did seem, when I was watching on Saturday, I took this away. Some other people didn't. You took this away as well. I thought they really put the shell on the offense once Ben went out there. They mixed in a couple of trick plays. They threw it to him once. They let Jack throw a pass.
Yeah.
They let Jack throw a pass. But otherwise, they leaned on the run game a lot, which was very successful. But I really thought they sort of put the clamps on Branson, which in his first career start or real game experience on the road, not in a blowout, in a tough environment against a really good defense, is understandable. But this week, with a full week to sort of install Ben, Chance isn't going to go on Saturday. I'm not so sure he's going to go on Saturday.
Yeah.
Especially you're facing an opponent in Stanford who really has struggled in every which way possible. And we can be honest, I don't think there's really going to be much of a road environment on Saturday. No. So I don't think Ben will have to really worry about. Yeah, don't
get me wrong. I mean, like I said, they're all studying, making rockets to the moon and stuff. That's what Stanford does.
More important things than football. But I just think that sort of intimidation factor of Ben would be like out the window. And you just look at Stanford. I have wrote down some numbers here on Stanford. I lost the page, so we'll get to that. But Stanford this year, I mean, man, they've just really struggled. And this game plan really just leans to where the Beavers can, kind of just let Branson and the offense just sort of do their thing. I mean, Stanford is 124th nationally in running defense. 124th.
Oh, I got one. I got one for you.
210 or nearly 211 yards per game.
I got one.
They ranked 90th nationally in passing efficiency defense, 140 essentially. They've only forced 2 turnovers this year. 2.
Yeah,
only
like you said.
Fresno State, Texas, and Notre Dame have forced the same or less turnovers. They are 131st in turnover margin. They have. This is on the other side of the. Go ahead. Sorry. I mean, regardless, a lot of those numbers right there tell you running game should be effective regardless of who's in there at quarterback, regardless of who is there. Ben should be able to take care of the football because Stanford hasn't created those opportunities yet this year. And he has a chance to be very efficient because, again, along with the fact that they haven't picked anything off, they really haven't kept quarterbacks from being sort of efficient in the passing game, which I think would be a strength of Ben. I'm curious to see how much they'll run him. Brian Lindgren yesterday said, they keep that in mind. He's a athletic guy. He's big as well, maybe not quite Cam Newton size, but they could run him a little bit and spread the defense out. So I'd be curious to see that. But a lot of those just sort of peripheral numbers sort of say that, people are paranoid about the Stanford game, but just the numbers just tell you that the Stanford team's not very good. And and you'd think, oh, this is their get right game. It's well, I mean, we've had some people on the show this week that said, we had Petros on yesterday. And I think Petros and Alex Faust are the ones calling that Stanford Oregon game last week, I believe. And Petros said, Stanford thought Oregon was their get-right game too, and they were down 31-3 at the half.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think
that's how it shook out.
I think Stanford, TJ, is still, and Cal a little bit too. I think both those teams are still experiencing the negative effects of COVID. And I say that because there was not a more restrictive place in America than San Francisco, and specifically Berkeley and Palo Alto counties. And you think about, how Stanford, TJ, you weren't here, but do you remember when Stanford lived on the road for half of the year? You combine that with the lack of ability to potentially have recruits on visits, all the things that every school was working through. And, we're finding out that perhaps the schools that may be a little more open are having an easier time, working their way back in. But
or ones that just ignored the rules altogether.
Well, there is that too. There is that too. But it's fascinating to me because I think David Shaw is one hell of a coach, and up there with Whittingham is the dean of Pac-12 coaches. I mean, you look at, there for a while, and Beaver fans remember David Shaw was the only kryptonite to Chip Kelly and Oregon and, their blur offense. So that's definitely something that, I think Oregon State fans are always going to think of as hey, David Shaw is really good, Stanford's good, but in this case, the uniforms might be a little magic. Like I said earlier in the podcast, Oregon State or Stanford has not beaten an FBS team in a year. They beat Oregon first weekend of October last year. They have not beaten a Division I team since then at the high level. Obviously, they beat Colgate to open this season, but I think that works in Oregon State's favor. And additionally, all those reasons you mentioned, Stanford being dead last in the country in turnover margin, the run defense, Oregon State should be able to run, and I think the lack of environment, like, it's not to say that you can, look down on Stanford, but I think this is a game that Oregon State has to feel they can win regardless of what their situation is at quarterback. And I agree with you. I think if it's close, Ben will probably play just because we've seen that's how Oregon State has handled injuries in the past with Smith and co.
And I think Ben would do a good job. I mean, we both watched him play during the fall. I mean, the guy is so talented. He really is. And again, everything they would want to do on offense against Stanford, Ben could do. The only thing that would drop off really is probably the deep passing game. Ben's got an absolute cannon for an arm. I mean, stronger than chances. I mean, easily the strongest arm of that quarterback room. But, that accuracy wise, the timing wasn't fantastic. I don't know how much they'll let him throw deep in that game. But, as everything, the numbers and the tape has shown, is like those opportunities will be there.
Right.
And another thing that is like just really puzzling with Stanford, did you know they have the 22nd ranked roster and talent composite? I mean,
I don't doubt it because they usually recruit extremely well. Like I said, David Shaw.
Listen to these schools they're ahead of in talent. Arkansas, Kentucky, UCLA, TCU, Utah, and Oklahoma State. I believe all of those teams are ranked.
And that's where I say maybe Stanford's still a little young, and they, they're not going to fire David Shaw, so he'll be back next year no matter what happens. So maybe they turn it around, but like they just have been in this stretch, TJ, where I still feel like they have not gotten out, like, the lack of better terms, the COVID cobwebs.
Yeah, maybe. I try and think about that. Like, you're right. It might just be a lot of recruiting stuff. I mean, right. I feel like the practice stuff is probably,
that's a big part of it too.
They're about like, but you're about like a year and a half from that, right? Because last year was normal-ish, I guess, for Stanford. They probably still had some restrictions, right, but they weren't kicked off of campus, right? They were there. They were going to class. Everything was as is, and now everything as is. So I don't know. You're right. It'll be interesting to see how they turn it around, but also a perspective, Brenden, to think about is, Stanford isn't like, they're a very good college football program, but they're not a perennial 10-11 win team program. Not historically. No. I mean, what Jim Harbaugh and David Shaw did in the late 2000 or early or late, I don't know,
early
from 2008 2008 to 2018.
Right.
That was sort of the exception of Stanford football, not the norm.
I would agree.
You could think about this more as Stanford sort of coming back to earth a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree. I would definitely agree with that statement. And, again, Oregon State going to get a chance to prove that this weekend as they face Stanford, 8 p.m. At least we get an ESPN game, TJ. About time.
Yeah, people asking for it, and you get the best time slot too. So
right. I got a quick trivia for you to end up or just to wrap up the podcast. Do you know the last time Oregon State won down on the farm?
2006.
There it is, man. You must have been talking to Mike Parker this week.
I've done my research.
Yeah. No, you think about it in that perspective, like you said 2008 on, like Stanford just got really good. And I think that's a part of it.
Mike Riley beat Jim Harbaugh one time, right? Or beat Jim Harbaugh in Palo. I think it was Jim's first year they beat him down there, if I remember correctly. Let's see if I wrote it down.
Yeah, Stanford. So yes, Jim Harbaugh beat Mike Riley in 2008 to open the season. And then 3 weeks later, Oregon State beat number 1 USC. So that was a bit of an interesting.
It was a pre-Harbaugh team, 2006. Harbaugh was hired in 2006.
Yeah, Harbaugh wasn't there in 2006. That was the Walt Harris 1-11 Cardinal in 2006. Man, yeah, rough times. But no, I think all that is kind of encapsulated into why maybe there's a little bit of like, hey, it's still Stanford. But I think it's also important to keep in context what TJ said. He put a great point. the last 10 or so years of Stanford football has maybe been the exception, not the rule. And we're seeing right now, Stanford's kind of reeling while they could see Oregon State as their get-right game, and I could see that from both sides. I think, like TJ said, the numbers stack up better in Oregon State's favor. I think Oregon State's a more cohesive unit. I think they're better coached right now. I think they're more together, have a better, identity and game plan, even with some of their issues. However, Stanford has the advantage of the quarterback in this matchup. Tanner McKee is a good quarterback. You guys are going to see him playing on Sundays. So that's where I think Oregon State needs to, get good quarterback play out of Ben Gulbranson or Chance Nolan, whoever ends up going in this game. That's my key to this one, TJ. And obviously check back to BeaversEdge.com later in the week for TJ's prediction, our injury reports, all that stuff. Real quick, what's your kind of key to this one? I think force a turnover or two, and you have to commit less than 2. Let's just say 2.
Yeah, turnovers can't happen, right? Like you said, less than 2. I would say 1 or none, right? With in the turnover department, I want to see the pass rush come alive in this game. I think they got Caleb Williams to the ground one time. They got Cam Rising to the ground one time. Stanford has given up 13 sacks in the last 2 weeks. I would expect Oregon State to at least want to add to that number. I think they should add to that number on Saturday, and I think that right there will equate. That might level the playing field a little bit with a more greener Ben Gulbranson. On the other side, Oregon State's offensive line has allowed, I think, 4 sacks all season. So that's a number off the top of my head. I don't have the stats page up, but when I was peeking at it yesterday, that's what it was. It is considerably less than what Stanford has allowed. I think that might be a little bit of an equalizer there. It'll be fun to see.
No doubt. And again, it's going to be interesting because for Oregon State, this is going to be a little bit more like their first 3 games as opposed to their last. Again, not to, just continue to beat down the Cardinal, but respectfully, Stanford is not USC and Stanford is not Utah. And particularly Stanford's home environment is not Rice-Eccles Stadium, is not Fresno State even. And I give credit to Fresno State. They got a better atmosphere than what Stanford's rocking these days. So I think all that is definitely going to be working in Oregon State's favor. It's a great get-right game, and I think the opportunity's there. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see who lands at quarterback for Oregon State. Again, we'll probably know game time decision, who's ultimately there. But at this point, you'd have to think it's, probably close to 50-50, maybe less. I mean, it just kind of depends on how Chance Nolan's status is. And again, with practices being closed, we're left, holding our breath as well. So again, want to thank TJ Mathewson for coming on the pod. As always, we'll be back next week to obviously talk about this game and then look ahead as Oregon State will be back to Reser Stadium for a matchup with Washington State. A couple weeks on the road, Beavers will be coming back for homecoming. That game gets a 6 o'clock kickoff, so they move back up a little bit as far as the timelines for those kickoffs. So again, TJ, appreciate you jumping on the pod with me, man. It's going to be a good game. Excited to see if Oregon State can kind of get right, because it's been a bit of a backward step these last 2 weeks.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. But again, like with the road environments, this will be they won't have to worry about the energy from the crowd. I'll say that. So it'll be a fun one to see.
No doubt. Well, again, big thanks to TJ Mathewson. Keep it locked to BeaversEdge.com. We'll have complete coverage leading up to the matchup. We'll have, obviously, predictions, see what TJ's thinking, what I'm thinking, what our recruiting guy Dylan's thinking as well. And we'll obviously have the injury report and a whole bunch of other stuff leading up to the content or to the start of the game as well. So keep it locked to BeaversEdge.com. Appreciate everyone tuning in and listening to this edition of the Edge podcast. We'll be back next week.